The goal for this lecture, and this is going to be a little bit of a longer video presentation. The goal is going to be to determine and look at and discover what happens after the Mexican-American War, after we get this land, after we deal with the aftermath of the Wilmot Proviso. And so what we're going to look at is, we have all this new land, now what? And we're going to try and delve into 5 big issues that are created as a result of Wilmot opening Pandora's box, opening up the issue of slavery for discussion on the congressional floor. We're going to look at how Congress tried to solve their differences. Sorry about that. We'll look at how Congress tried to solve their differences and how that ties in this idea of popular sovereignty and what that means. And then we'll also use the events of the Compromise of 1850 to assess how they did. I'm sorry, the events after the Compromise of 1850. So we'll look back at the Compromise of 1850, looking at things that happened to see how did it work out? Did the compromise work? So here is the United States in 1850, and this is going to be as of the Compromise of 1850. And so what we're talking about when we talk about the Mexican Cession is, of course, this territory over here. I want to focus on this chart real quick and some questions that I want you to consider. What we have here is cotton production, and we see going from 1790 to 1860, you see the dramatic increase in the amount of cotton that's being produced in the United States, specifically in the South. And if you look at this chart, I want you to think, why would Southerners want to protect slavery? How does slavery tie into this chart? How did slavery expansion impact slavery where it existed? We talked a little bit about that in class today. And what are the South's choices? And I would like for you to be prepared to discuss these ideas. If we look at why would Southerners want to protect slavery, I hope you can see the financial implications that this chart could present. How did slavery expansion impact slavery where it existed? Think about the Senate. And then what are the choices? What are the choices that the South has? Well, they can work with the North, they can work against the North, or they can start to threaten to leave the Union altogether. I did this demo in both classes today, where I separated 2 groups of people to Democrats and Whigs, and then talked about how there were Northerners and Southerners in both, and then brought up Wilmot's Proviso and saw how the dynamic shifted, where Northerners went with Northerners, Southerners with Southerners, regardless of whether or not they were Whigs or Democrats. And in 1848, a president is elected, Zachary Taylor, and in the midterm in 1850, what we get a Congress that is made up primarily of sectional politicians. No Democrat, not really. They were Democrats, or maybe they were Whigs, or they might have been emerging free soilers or something like that. But really, what they were first and foremost was they were abolitionists, or they were staunch supporters of Southern states' rights, which we call fire eaters. And these are the people that are going to have to decide the fate of the country in 1850. They're the ones that are going to have to determine what can and can't be compromised. And the question that we have to consider is, can extremists compromise? If you have somebody who is an abolitionist who believes that slavery is morally wrong, can they ever compromise with Southerners to allow slavery to continue to exist somewhere or even expand? And vice versa, if you have somebody who is a staunch supporter of slavery, can they compromise with Northerners to halt the expansion of slavery, or maybe even limit slavery in some way? So what were the issues? And these, you need to have these down. You don't have space. I'm sorry, you have space on the right-hand side of the notes. I would say that this would be on the side with section 1 of chapter 10. But here are the issues, and these are the 5 big issues that I referenced on the goal page. What's Texas? Where's its border? And what happens to the debt that Texas had from when it was its own country? Does the United States have to pay that, or does Texas pay that? Another big, and here's Texas, the land dispute. You see where we know where Texas is, but this is what Texans were claiming was Texas. Another issue, is this idea of slavery in the new territory. We know what Wilmot wanted, and we know what the Free Soilers wanted, but the Southerners aren't willing to accept that. And so we have this idea of forcing slavery down the throat of those who don't want it. Free Soilers want the West open for white settlement, white employment. A third issue is California. California, because of the gold rush in 1849, zooms through the population requirements and is ready to become a state. They wanted to become a free state. How do we balance that? A fourth issue is slave trade in Washington, D.C. Now that we have abolitionists coming to Congress to work, to be congressmen, and they are looking at and walking past slavery and the slave trade in the nation's capital, they are bothered by that, and they wanted to end the practice of slave trade in Washington, D.C. And here's an example of a slave auction house in Washington, D.C. Then the fifth issue is what the Southerners were most upset about, which was, and a lot of you looked at the Underground Railroad for your research project, but as their property escapes, runs away, Southerners wanted some recourse to get their property back. They wanted a more stringent fugitive slave law, a law that would allow them to go into the North, would allow them to go into these northern states to get their property back. We remember Henry Clay from the Missouri Compromise, and in 1850 he's going to attempt one last compromise. And so here's what he did. You take those 5 issues and he puts them all into one bill. It's called an omnibus bill, a big package. And so the question for you is, how would that be a compromise? And what I want you to think of is, if the Fugitive Slave Act is a part of it and Northerners have to vote for it and Southerners have to vote for it, are they compromising? Or you think of something like ending the slave trade in D.C. If they have to both vote for it, is that a compromise? And Henry Clay believed that that was the best way to get them to compromise. However, the president vowed that if he got that big bill, he would veto it. All he really was concerned about was California. He didn't want to deal with the rest. It fails in a committee, and so the big package bill doesn't pass. And the fact that it doesn't pass kind of exhausts Henry Clay, and he gives up on it. The pieces will be picked up by a new generation of politicians, a new politician, or a new emerging powerful politician from Illinois. His name was Stephen A. Douglas. And Stephen A. Douglas, that's him right there, he has a new idea, and what he's going to do is he's going to, and I'm going to explain all this in a second, but I'm just going to put this up there. He's going to take the pieces of the omnibus bill and he's going to break it into individual components. Now, the reason that he's going to be able to do this, and Clay wasn't, is that Zachary Taylor actually dies while he's in office in July of 1850, and I'll tell you that story next Monday. It's kind of an interesting story that I have a newspaper article that I'll show you. But Taylor's dead, Clay's at home, and Douglas, he picks up the pieces of the compromise and he passes them one at a time, but he does so in a way where he gets coalitions of voters to vote on them, so he doesn't have the extremists voting for either side. So you could vote for the Fugitive Slave Act, but not vote for ending the slave trade in D.C. Or you could vote for ending the slave trade in D.C., but vote against funding Texas's debt, things like that. And so the question that we have to ask then is, is that really a compromise? If you're sneaking, like this cartoon suggests, if you're sneaking the Fugitive Slave Act into the pocket of a northern politician, or if you're doing these things that doesn't have the consent of those politicians, is it truly a compromise? So when we look at the Compromise of 1850, it is very divisive. It divides the country even further because each section seems to be getting what they wanted, but they're still angry and they don't like what the other side got, and they don't feel responsible for it because they didn't have to vote for it. Here's a quote from Abraham Lincoln from 1858. He said, "In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house will fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." Here's the United States in 1850. Now, as a result of the Compromise of 1850, as a result of this new way of thinking, what they were going to decide to do was to open up this territory to something called popular sovereignty. Right? So you see the Utah territory, the New Mexico territory, cutting off what Texas believed was theirs. This idea of popular sovereignty, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to that last one. This idea of popular sovereignty is that the people who move there will get to decide whether or not to bring slaves by whether or not they bring them. This is thought up by a guy named Lewis Cass from Michigan, who was a politician. Eventually, he'd be a presidential candidate. But the idea of popular sovereignty removes the Congress from that responsibility during the territory stages, and it puts it on the people. So imagine a scenario like this. Now, this doesn't happen here, but I'll use it as the example. But let's say the Utah Territory, let's say 45% of the people that move there bring slaves, and 55% of the people that move there don't bring slaves. And when it's time to decide when they were going to become a state, the majority would rule. So the question that would be left to be answered later is, what do the 45% of the population who brought their slaves to this territory because they could, and now it becomes a free state, what are they supposed to do? What happens to their property? But that seemed like a long way off and something that they could solve later. However, it wasn't that long of a way off, because in 1854, Stephen A. Douglas, in order to get more people moving into this territory, helped pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which opened up this territory to popular sovereignty. Now, we know that this is north of 3630. It's not supposed to have slaves. Stephen A. Douglas just ignored the Missouri Compromise. He ignored this thing that had been holding the Union together for so long, and he said, no, we're going to open it up to popular sovereignty. When we come back on Monday, we are going to get into the aftermath of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And just to preview some of the places that we're going to go and where you should be focusing your reading, we will talk about Bleeding Kansas. We will talk about how the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed for Kansas to become the testing ground of popular sovereignty. We will talk about how, and you will need to discuss how, that idea of popular sovereignty and the dispute over it actually spills into the Senate floor with this savage beating of Charles Sumner. And I think we had a Charles Sumner in the research project. We will look at how the idea of popular sovereignty is going to also usher in a landmark Supreme Court decision about the Missouri Compromise, about territories and slavery. And we will pick up with this on Monday.